Welcome, everybody, to Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host, Estelle Erasmus, the author of Writing That Gets Noticed, Find Your Voice, Become a Better Storyteller, Get Published, which was named by Poets and Writers a best book for writers. Every week, I speak with novelists, with authors, with writers of every niche to talk about their tips, their tricks, their strategies, and how the sauce is made, including creative advice. I'll talk about essays and articles and share my own experience from 3 decades of publishing. So join me every week and grow your business and build your craft with Freelance Writing Direct. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. And follow along on Substack, where I share special clips for subscribers only at estelleserasmus.substack.com. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of Freelance Writing Direct. I'm your host and executive producer, Estelle Erasmus, and today I am absolutely delighted to have Tia Levings with us, and she is the author of the fabulous memoir, A Well-Trained Wife. And let me tell you a little bit about her. She is the New York Times bestselling author of A Well-Trained Wife, her memoir of escape from Christian patriarchy. She writes about the realities of religious trauma, evangelical patriarchy, and the trad wife life, decoding the fundamentalist influences in our news and culture. Her work and quotes have appeared in Teen Vogue, Salon, Newsweek, and the Huffington Post. She also appeared in the hit Amazon docuseries Shiny Happy People. Based in Raleigh, North Carolina, she is mom to 4 incredible adults and likes to travel, hike, paint, and daydream. Find her on social media at Tia Levings Writer. Her second book, I Belong to Me, releases May 5th, 2026. Welcome, Tia, to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, congrats on the second book.
Yes, thank you.
Very exciting as well. So for those who don't know, can you just give a little snapshot of what A Well-Trained Wife is, going beyond what I already said?
Yeah, a lot of times I describe it as the real life prequel to The Handmaid's Tale because that's a cultural show people are familiar with. And there was something before Gilead, and that is what Christian fundamentalism is today. When we were coming up in the 80s and 90s, it was just a more devout way to be a Christian, an evangelical Christian, and it blended into the mainstream quite a bit, but it was fringe and not very pronounced and just seemed like another way to be a Christian, which there are many, many different kinds, so it's like another flavor. The actual truth behind it is that they had an agenda to take over the culture, to take over mainstream religion, to take over the globe ultimately, because they're dominionists. And they believe that God has given them a mandate to take over and make the world a Christian globe. That sounds like an abstract ideal when you're the minority or you feel persecuted or a small group, but they had a strategy in place, and I was living through that in the 90s as I was raising children, which was to raise an army for God, to infiltrate the government, to become a major political force in the country. And a lot of this was driven by what they were fearing was going to happen with our demographics, in that white people would become a minority. And there's a lot of aspects to this, but the nut result of it is where we are today with Christian nationalism is the culmination of that entire movement. And they see America as a theocracy, not a democracy. And that's what they would like to institute. So living that, seeing that like sold online in pretty images or as solutions to our problems is very prevalent right now. And I told my story in part because I have the reality check of what it's actually like to live their vision. Something I say a lot is the way they run their homes is the way they want to run their country, because that model of the family is their governing model that they just build to scale. And so it's really important to pay attention to what's happening in their homes, because that is their vision for every home. So when people hear my story and they're like, oh, wow, I don't know if I want to live like that, That's exactly what I'm hoping you'll take away from it, because it is not a healthy way to live. It doesn't have produce beautiful, fruitful outcomes like they promise. And we won't know that unless we listen to survivors.
What you went through, and you detail it in the book from part one, which is the grooming,
Hmm.
starting when you were very young. And your book was the first, I believe, of the trad wife, purity culture, fundamentalist books. You really opened the door to talking about these situations that are so destructive to women,
Yeah.
particularly
Yeah.
taking this literal interpretation of the Bible and just
Mhm.
throwing it against any freedom that a woman had. And to me, it's so amazing that you were able to break free. And I think one of the ways that you did it, when you started taking the photos and then you started writing on Trapdoor, and you were one of the original bloggers of
I
that
was.
whole, and that gave you the freedom. And you even say visibility keeps you safe. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that was your own trapdoor to
Right.
getting out?
So everything about that life divides you immediately by your gender. There's very strict gender roles. And so women are equipped to do one thing, men are equipped to do another. And there's visibility differences between them. And so it's very slow. It's a perfect use of the frog in the boiling water metaphor, because very slowly as you grow, you're making choices that make your life ever more isolated and solitary and small, but you don't realize that's what you're doing. You think you're focusing on your home, or you're protecting boundaries of your home. You're focusing your energies on raising your children. There's this way that you elevate every choice to be godly and to be in support of the lifestyle. And that's a really important thing to realize, is that the outcome of that isn't good fruit. And Christians are taught to examine fruit. They're told not to be judgmental, but that you should know something by its fruit. And so what I do is look at the fruit of the movement. And the fruit of all the isolation is that you no longer have any visibility in society. And that's their goal for women. They don't want women in the public sector. They don't want us voting. They don't want a democracy. The men in charge want white men, landowning men in charge. So we have things like head of household voting on the table. And this dominance and submissive vertical power model of authority is extremely important, because the entire structure is built on it. And you can't have vocal, visible women rocking the boat of the power source on top. So everything is in service to the ideology. And that's one of the tells for fundamentalism, is that the method and the formula and the outcome and the ideal that you're chasing, that is what's of value. And anything that you do or suffer in service to it is glorified, because you're doing it for this good cause, but it's consumptive and it capitalizes your family and it exploits people. And if you're struggling with that, the system suggests something's wrong with you. You're not doing it right. You're not doing it according to the letter of the law. You need to repent. It's always a personal calibration. It's always a personal failing, and never a reflection of this system that has never served. This system, we have tried patriarchy in this model so many times in history, and it always meets the same end. And rather be like aware of that, they blame the people. So as a wife, I was holding this bag. These are my outcomes. I know I'm giving this everything I have. I'm trying so hard to be perfect. And no matter what I do, I get smaller. I'm breaking. I can't hold this up. My children are suffering. We're not having any good in the world. We're just more and more an island. And we had violence at the same time, but that comes along with a lot of dominance and submission type talking. They'll do a lot of campaigning and visibility around women should submit and you should be a submissive wife. And I know we hear that in these circles a lot. Not so much the answer to the question of like, well, what happens if she won't? How are you going to keep her in line? They have answers for those, but they don't talk about them. So I was living those realities and not being able to hold up the system anymore. And so what happened was a series of cracks that were actually cult cracks. And eventually I had to escape, because my life and my children's lives were on the line. Like, I really waited too long in the process, the inevitable process that everyone faces. I waited until too long.
Yeah, and you have the book broken up into sections: groom, wife, which is when you marry Alan, who's
Hmm.
indoctrinated in the faith, and that kind of overlooks all his failings and red flags, which you show throughout in the writing. In the way, because you're starting to get your visibility, which the elders are really hating the people in the church, and she should go, and there comes later he wants to take over the finances, all the things that every time you're turning, you're doing, and you're trying to struggle. And it's interesting when you finally leave, and this is a real narrative arc in here, because you start in your prologue, you get into the violence and how you're saying it's your fault, and that's the indoctrination that you have. But then you're realizing it was up to you to save you. And then you go back talking about how you were groomed, how you were married. How did you decide on the structure of this? And I know that you also worked with Lisa Cooper Ellison, who is a friend and a fellow colleague.
Yeah, I worked a lot with her, and she did my developmental edit and really helped me focus the momentum and logic of the story and the scenes. We did a lot of work on situation versus story. Deeply indebted. That was a valuable process. I read a ton of memoirs and a lot of different models, and I knew that I had something that would potentially read like a novel. It had that kind of propulsive narrative, and so that helped me decide against something like braided form or essays, things that weren't going to take advantage of that momentum. I wanted it to be as compelling as I knew the scenes were to live. Living that way was I've always felt like I was racing and out of breath and failing and striving and trying. And so I wanted that energy to show on the page, and structure I knew was going to be a big part of that. So if you back that structure up, you read the different parts out, but that's a spin on a popular verse that was used to train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it, is the verse that was used to justify corporal punishment and strict discipline. And I twisted it for my structure because I feel the table of contents are kind of like this place where you can insert some poetry and some subtext of texture. There's so much more to the telling of a story than the actual mechanical parts. And you can't get too poetic in places sometimes, but I wanted there to be an air of it in the whole book. So the table of contents are one of my little nerdy places where I like to look at the project from the 20,000 feet level and say, okay, what am I telling here? And where am I reframing old messaging? So I did this in I Belong to Me as well. The table of contents is a challenge on old messaging and flip the script. And so that's where you get that. Yeah, I read a lot, and I looked at propulsive style memoirs. I would say probably Wild and Educated were two of my biggest initial comps, but I got some advice early on that I really took to heart, which was don't compare yourselves to the biggest books. Those are not your comps when you're a debut. And so I found smaller books and, just wider books and also out of genre to take inspiration from. And I don't actually remember the comps that we used in the proposal because that's a few years ago now. But what Lisa is actually the one who told me, she said, you want your editor to come back and say, oh, we think you're like this book. And that did happen, it was a nice kind of ego check, but also scale, like writing to scale. You can't know what your success is going to be from the beginning. You can just write the best thing you can write. And
So, you said something that really resonates. It is propulsive and it does read like a novel, and the best memoir does read like a novel. And I wouldn't quite call it memoir plus, although it is memoir plus,
yeah,
because you give a lot of history of the movement. You give that information, but it's wielded so well, it's melded so well into the rest of the story that I don't feel like I do sometimes with Memoir Plus, like, okay, here is your history lesson now.
right.
Here are your little tidbits and your facts. How did you manage to do that?
Yes, thank you for that because that was a lot of intentional work. And again, Lisa had this marvelous line. It is still my very favorite editing line in the whole world. So I'm very story driven. I'll tell stories all day. I just go and my stories will go, and I will I did this in the draft, which was, by the time she saw it, was probably the ninth draft, ninth or 11th draft. I'd worked on it for 10 years and that's kind of a rocky road, but it really got steam when I started working with Lisa on it. She would go through the story with me, like she's reading along, and then she would write, I don't know what this means. And that would help me clue in, like, I'm speaking with insider language here, or I'm assuming the reader has the same background I have. I need to pause for a second and put in some expository. And so it does naturally flow because it is interactive with an editor and a reader that's like, wait a second, I don't know what that is. And I never wanted anything to take you out of the story. I wanted you to get your information in a very fluid way, in an organic way, because that is also what it was like to live it. We were discovering these things as we were practicing them. So I worked really hard on that, and I'm glad that that was your takeaway.
So when you did it, did you have a document with the data sets and another document with the scenes? And then you thought, okay, this little piece could go here and here's how I'm going to weave it in? Or how did that happen?
Once I decided to tell this as a memoir in my own name, which was 6 or 7 years into the process, I had these two massive writing binges. They were just dumps. I had a 60,000 word week, and then I had a second 62,000 word week, and I ended up with this large document. So there was a process of cutting out and moving around where it was, but in the end, it was much more from my soul and from my memory and from my what I already know, my knowledge base that this experience gave me, that I do in my work every day. Spend every day in, like, kind of translating the evangelical codes that are in our headlines and news and entertainment. And that just is the gift that life gave me. I look at this big 20-year, 25-year experience I had in Christian patriarchy, and it could look like a black hole. It could look like a span of loss. In some ways it is, but in other ways it gave me this pretty rich encyclopedia of experience and knowledge that didn't expect to have a home in the world. And if they hadn't been successful in getting this far and having a trad wife movement and everything that they're doing in our current day, it wouldn't be that useful to my career. It turns out I have something to offer everyone right now that is a direct result of that. So a lot of this just comes from me because I lived it, and firsthand experience kind of pours from me. And they're not surprising. Like, they are doing the same things that they have always done. And what the only difference is that now there are survivors speaking out about it. They've never had this point in history before where listeners have choices. You can listen to the people preaching it, or you can listen to the people who actually lived it.
So before you wrote the memoir, you did have a repository of writing about your life from Trapdoor, from blogging. Were you able to incorporate that almost like a diary, but using the pieces from it and then expanding?
A little. Some of that's reference material, going to the source and reading my journal. I know there's no journal excerpts. There's no big chunks that are removed and transferred over, but I keep receipts. I kept everything. I kept, all our legal documents. I have my excommunication paperwork. I have all the books we learned from. So holding on to that turned out to be one of the best archives that I could dig through. Sometimes that helps jog my memory on something, or my scrapbooks, those kinds of things, little notes, little minutia from the day.
Could you read a passage from your book? Thank you.
Okay, so we are just past the halfway point of the book at this portion, and I'm just going to set it up a little bit. I was confronted with a decision that my husband wanted me to agree to. It was something called domestic discipline, and it is a high control spanking practice applied to adults. We're very used to corporal punishment and spanking being discussed as for children, but there is a portion of this religious journey that includes doing it for adults. And when I was presented with it, I was really struggling and wanted to get a divorce. So I knew I wasn't supposed to. Death is preferable to divorce in this group. And so I went to my first counselor, and that's what this scene is. So, hello, Mrs. Brown. How can I serve you today? The counselor led me to a room full of books and sat behind a glistening wood desk in a tufted leather chair. Alan would love a study like this. I glanced at the certificates on the wall and noted close, smiling eyes behind his glasses. I felt grateful to be in a safe place, finally able to release my secrets. With a tremor, I gave him my letter. "Oh, good. It's helpful to have notes," he said. I watched as he scanned the violence. His face paled when he got to the part about the spanking. But I relaxed as I started to feel sure of his advocacy and protection. Somehow, the kids and I would be safe. "Mrs. Brown, I see this all the time," he said, folding my letter and handing it back to me. "You do?" I felt dizzy. How could he see this all the time? Was it mainstream? Did everyone do it? "Yes, I'm constantly handed out the same advice to wives like yourself." I sat forward in my chair, anxious to hear the words that would help me get a divorce. "What you need, Mrs. Brown," he paused, "is to honor your husband more. Do what he asks, less of what he doesn't. Honor your husband more. You need to ask yourself what you're doing that's driven your husband to this point, and you need to submit to him." My veins ran cold. My body numbed like anesthesia. I mumbled a goodbye and walked like a zombie to the van. Submission. Respect. The problem wasn't what was done to me, but how I reacted. I turned for home, disoriented and dissociated. Over the St. John's River, I wondered how I'd gotten there. Why was I driving on the bridge? I recounted the list. First Baptist, Allen, honor him, home. My brain strained to rationalize. What if there was wisdom in appointments over outbursts? What if knowing when the pain would come helped me hide it? Like a tea bag steeped in hot water, the elements came together, only I'd never held a cup so hot. I walked through our home on my tiptoes. What ultimately tipped my scale was a faint pink line on the stick. I was pregnant with number 5. What if random violence and fighting were what caused Clara's defect? What if I could prevent that from happening again by helping Alan stay in control? "How's that contract coming?" he asked a few days later, referring to the contract that agreed to channeled violence.
Wow, that is so powerful. And you transport the reader. We are with you as you are talking to this counselor who you thought was going to be your hope. You, out of a lifetime of experience, being groomed, being married, having 5 kids, you had so many choices to make with scenes and what to include. How did you cut what needed to be cut? How did you decide what needed to be included in your book?
Yeah, so I mentioned that Lisa and I worked a lot on The Situation in the Story, which is a book by Vivian Gornick. It's really helpful. A lot of people are probably familiar with it. But what we took from that was that you don't need multiple scenes to make the same point. So while all of the violence in my story has multiple scenes like it. Like there were many sexual assaults, many spanking events, many animal deaths. But I had to be sensitive to the reader and what they needed in order to get the essence of the story that I was telling. So we just listed the scenes and picked the most powerful ones. It really was a analytical process of picking what's doing the most work here and is it effective and can we move on to the next thing, not belaboring any specific thing, because the violence itself feels belaboring. You're already going year after year after year with me, wondering why can't you get out? Why won't she get out? Why doesn't she just leave? And so being cognizant of that meant no extra hammers on any scenes. It was also really freeing for me because I was able to put it on the page and move on to the next one, which is not always what it felt like to live it. And then that you're in the scene with me has been the takeaway from publishing, because I do feel now like there are people in those scenes with me when I felt so alone. Writing, putting this into audio format and hearing back from readers, me too, like that happened to me too. I get that a lot. That helps me feel less alone in those memories. It's been redemptive to my actual recollection that I didn't put into the book.
Yeah, your book really helped create a movement to help people who are potentially going through this or could be
Yeah.
groomed to go through this. When you were ending each chapter, Did you use any techniques to help guide the reader to read forward to the following chapter?
Yeah, somewhat. So we wanted cliffhangers and we wanted page turners. I wanted to end on curious notes, questions, and I wanted to keep it an open so that you had to turn the page to find out what happened, but also really paying attention to paragraphs and making sure they're leading into one another. That's just writing craft. This is my baby first book, so I know I'll get stronger at that as we go, but it was wonderful to learn it and what goes into writing something that's compelling and page turning. I did not want them to put it away and walk away. So the result is that sometimes I hear people read it in 24 hours and I'm like, your poor nervous system. I can't even read it in 24 hours.
There's a lot of triggering things in there, but
Yes.
you do the aftermath as well
Hmm.
after escaping
Yeah.
from Alan and talking about how you found Cary Grant, CG,
Hmm.
got married, got divorced. And then at the end, I read in the acknowledgments, you thank John. He's the new person, or
Well,
not so new.
sort of the new person. I've known John since I was 16, so there's a history there. But yeah, so when after I sold the book, I thought it was finished. And it pretty much ended with my escape. And my editor said, I would love more, which was a really wonderful thing to hear after working on getting the word count down. I loved hearing I want more, but she wanted more of a bridge between the person who left and the person that they meet online today. So I was able to add the back 25%, and it turned out to be extremely important to me and to readers because there's so much that happens in that aftermath. And this has been a big part of I Belong to Me, which is more of a hybrid because while it has my personal stories in it, it's categorized as self help and it's constructed like self-help that helps yourself. It's not prescriptive. But I spent a lot of time on the aftermath of shocking experiences. And the reason for that is because that can be a vague, long time that we don't articulate in our culture, but we make a ton of decisions within the space. So, in shock, in that aftermath, one of the things I did was I made a very common mistake in that I fell for other high control groups and people because they were familiar to my nervous system. And I was years away from understanding what any of that was. But we do that, we repeat patterns. And so while my second marriage wasn't violent, it was still very high control at times. We were not very compatible in the long run. And I didn't see that plot twist coming either when he when he said he didn't want to be married to a writer. But I was a different person, at that point. I had healed and I was no longer in the shock and aftermath of something. And so the parts of him that wanted to fix and provide and help someone who was damaged no longer had an outlet, which that is a really big part of my conviction for trauma healing. I want to help people get to a place where they're not making dependent decisions. They're not attracting predators. They're not looking for finding inner fulfillment through groups and ideologies that promise to make them happy or give them a sense of belonging. When I left, I had no sense of self, and that turned out to be much harder to recover than any of the violence that I had experienced. So that was the bridge to I Belong to Me.
I love at the ending that, and maybe that is the ending that your editor suggested you do, that you talked about the repercussions for a lot of these people. You really went into it. And
Mm-hmm.
you also equated with that cultural moment of Josh Dugar that
Mm-hmm.
you actually did a video, a reel about that went viral. Can you
Mm-hmm.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Duggar family shows up a lot in my background because they had their rise to fame the second half of my marriage. And I instantly recognized, that we're from the same group. And I was astonished to see that they were going to put reality TV cameras in their home because I knew what risk that opened them to, like what kinds of realities could get picked up on camera. It's to Jim Bob's hubris that he knew he could have cameras in his home and hide the parts that he didn't want the world to see. But the outcome of high control indoctrination, where children are beaten from the time they're infants and taught to suppress every instinct and they're dependent on an external moral code, they don't have any internal compass, is someone like Josh Duggar. And so when Josh Duggar hit the news, he repeatedly, for many indiscretions and horrible crimes, he was being othered as a bad apple and just a random one off. And I was like, no, he's actually a product of this. This is way more common to a lesser scale than we realize. And there's a lot of sheltered abuse in these homes, and it's hiding under this beautiful image. And I knew I could speak to that. It was this very clear moment. I was right in the middle of my work with Lisa and also Ashley Renard, and I was looking for a way to build my author platform. And like, how do I take a story that's so heavy about Christian patriarchy and religious extremism and make it applicable to what people are recognizing online and in real life, to mainstream? So the Duggars became a portal for that, because they themselves had centered themselves as pop stars. They're on TLC, big platform. And here was a survivor who could speak to the realities that come along with the ride for the ideologies that they're evangelizing. It's called lifestyle evangelism, and that's what they were doing with their reality TV show. And so criticism is fair. If you have
Yeah.
different results, it's fair. And so I became that dissenting voice of, hey, wait a minute, there's more you should know.
If someone's writing memoir today and maybe they haven't had such a horrible growing up and marriage and getting out of something experience, but if they're just writing their stories, what is your best advice for them?
Yeah, I never quantify or compare trauma. So if you were formed and shaped by an experience and it has applied to something that you've learned and there's a story you need to tell, the process is the same. What we're experiencing ourselves, it doesn't need to compare to someone else. Like, I don't scale or rate, this is bad enough to tell this story. No, that's the human story. It takes us all, it takes all of our perspectives. And so always, like, if you're feeling a propulsion to write and you want to explore it, the answer is yes, do it. You can't always know what outcome and what use or impact it will have from the get-go. That's something that evolves over time. But your job as the writer is to sit in the chair and write it, and then let the universe come to you with opportunities, and let doors be opened one at a time. There's lots of things that have happened on this path that I wouldn't have known from the beginning, but I couldn't have had them if I hadn't built the work first.
Yeah, it's really the writing has to come first, the telling the stories, being a storyteller. I
Mm-hmm.
think if you can look at yourself and say, I am really a storyteller and this
Yeah.
is what I'm doing. And then all that other stuff, platform, this and that comes later because
Mm.
you're just putting the story down.
I feel like one of the things that might get lost, and especially just in the memoir field, is that it is not a parade of all the bad things that happen to you. Get clear on why you want to tell this story. What is it about your experiences that apply and that are more broadly applicable to a reader? One of the things that is true of my feedback from a well-trained wife is many, many, many people will say, I didn't experience the same severity that you did, but I can relate. And I found myself in your pages much more than I expected to. And that really was a reflection of all the work we did on the universal and trying to find things that would be relatable on any human level. That, to my point of, we don't need to compare our experiences to get value from them. So also craft, working on craft. I knew what I wanted. I knew the kind of distribution and the reach and the achievement that I wanted to reach, but I needed there's elements to that you have to have in order to have that. So I did a lot of work on, like, reverse engineering what kinds of books get chosen for a bestseller. If you want to be on the New York Times bestselling list, there are certain paths you're going to have to pick. And then in order to get on those paths, there are certain choices you're going to have to make. And so it really did help narrow some of the decision making, because I could tell, based on the end goal that I want, that there's certain paths that are just not for me and I don't need to spend time spinning my wheels in them. So that was helpful. It's getting really clear on why are you telling the story and who do you help? Who do you want to reach?
And for your next book, was it easier to write than the first? I mean, the first
Ah,
took 10 years. This didn't take 10
right.
years, right?
It's been a very different experience. I sold it before Wife even came out. So that alone is very rare. So I didn't have sales numbers to go on, but we did have pre-order interest, and it was a very organic next book. Like, people wanted to know, but how did you heal? And so it did just kind of unspool on the page. The challenge was definitely the timeline, because I was writing it at the same time as promoting my first book. That was extremely hard, in a division of brain that isn't my favorite. I'm doing it again because I'm working on a novel right now and book three. I've also sold book three. And I'm in the middle of promoting Belong. And I was like, why did I do this again? Trying to write a new book while promoting one is really hard. But then also just the amount of time and cooked, like my memoir is very cooked. It's been very refined. I know my narrative. I know all the psychological healing that is, it's not newly scraped up when I talk about it. And I Belong to me is probably the last book that I can write like that, where it's really an extension of Wife in a lot of ways. You don't have to have read one in order to get benefit from it, but it is an extension of the subject matter. And so it didn't need 10 years to ruminate, but I think I would like a slower pace for future work because I really do like that amount of time where you can put it in the drawer and not think about it and come back to it with fresh eyes and really have multiple readers attack it before you take it professionally. So I'm learning as I go.
Is I Belong to Me Memoir Plus? So Memoir plus the instructional, how you got to where you are and how other people can? What's the structure?
It's categorized as self-help and sometimes hybrid. And it is on my arc. The reason why I hesitate is because I'm not fully sure how to categorize this myself anymore. It is a love letter to survivors. It is not like any other self-help or healing book on the market because it's the book that I needed when I was healing. And when I came out in 2007, and that's when I escaped, language around deconstruction and religious trauma and complex PTSD was still evolving and forming. We didn't have even the books that exist now. So it's a trailblazing book in the space because healing during that time was a trailblazing experience. So it makes it hard to like say it's like this book. It is again a non-prescriptive self-help book, which is really challenging to write because I don't want to tell you what to do. I want to tell you here's what I did to solve this or to address this, and here's how it worked for me, and here's what I've learned, and here are the experts that with this science, and so there is a lot of information in it. There's also a lot of experience in it. Also, I have such a deep love for this book that it's like sending my little kindergartner out there into the world. I love you so much, and I just hope that you land with the people that need you because you are a unique book.
My final question to you, and this has been such a rich discussion, is do you think about Julie or somebody from the past life
Mm.
reading this work and maybe the next one and seeing where you are? And I know they probably don't even have access to technology if men in charge have anything to say about it. But what do you think about that?
Well, Julie specifically is one of my dearest, closest friends, and she runs a big business, so she's no longer in it either. But I just have to shout out for Julie. I'm actually just going to do a discussion panel with me at Parnassus in May. But there is a long list of women in the book that can't read it, haven't read it, or can't speak about it if they had. So some behind the scenes interest here is that my audiobook outsells my hardcover 3 to 1, which has been very attention getting in audio land. Like, wow. But I think one portion of that is because it's easier to hide an audiobook than it is to have this big bright hardcover out on the shelf or out on the table. A lot of the Christians who I wrote about, even when I obscured their identities, have not come to me. Like they have not admitted that they've read the book. I wouldn't know if they were moved by it or not. And then I've had other people who grew up adjacent or knew me at that time and they're blown away. And they're like, I had no idea you were going through that. Thank you for writing it down. Thank you for sharing. And those have been powerful exchanges. I am always hoping that it falls into the right hands. I know that there's a group of people that take the jacket off, and we have a discrete jacket you can print at home. It's not on my website yet, but we've circulated it, and they can hide it, or they can gift it. It's in Kindle Unlimited, so like that's an easy way to read on private too. So I hear testimonials from people who are like, I couldn't tell anybody I was reading this, or my MAGA family can't find out. Yeah, that
That
happens.
that's fascinating. That's
Yeah.
really fascinating. Well, Tia, you have done so much through your writing. It's such a gift that you've helped people and
Thank you.
created this movement. And I'm so excited to read your next book, I Belong to Me. Everybody, Tia Levings, A Well-Trained Wife. It's an amazing excavation of this life that you shouldn't know from, but you will want to know about it. Thank you so much, Tia.
Thank you.
Follow me at EstelleSErasmus.com on my website. and on social media, which is Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, at Estelle S. Erasmus. And we're now on YouTube for Freelance Writing Direct. Follow along, and soon everyone will be reading what you're writing.